He mistook her quiet for emptiness, a shallow vessel to be filled with his own iron will. He did not know that her pulse was the ticking of an ancient clock, counting down the seconds until he would learn the true weight of her grace. The tether of a cold, proprietary hand. The slow burn of a secret buried in the marrow. A world that trembles when the fragile finds its fire. Tears that turn to starlight upon the freezing earth. The ending of a reign, the beginning of a prayer. The stone of the high keep was always cold, a deep, biting chill that seemed to seep through the soles of Alara's slippers and settle in the marrow of her bones. Yet she never complained, for silence was the only armor she was permitted to wear in the house of her mate. Kalen moved through the halls like a predator carved from shadow and obsidian, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic, a constant reminder of the power he wielded over the pack and over the woman he had claimed as his own. He had found her in the fringes of the southern woods, a pale slip of a thing with eyes the color of a winter sky, and he had taken her not with a request, but with the absolute certainty of a king claiming a stray jewel. To him, she was a fragile mystery, a creature of soft curves and hesitant breaths who needed the iron walls of his fortress to keep the world from crushing her. He did not know that the world had already tried to crush her and had failed, leaving behind a core of celestial fire that she kept buried beneath layers of feigned vulnerability. Every evening, when the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the mountains, he would come to their chambers, the scent of pine and cold rain clinging to his heavy furs, and he would touch her face with a hand that was surprisingly gentle, yet always proprietary. He spoke to her in tones one might use for a wounded bird, shielding her from the harsh realities of the coming war, the whispers of betrayal in the council, and the ancient shadows that were stirring in the dark places of the earth. He believed she was a human girl of no lineage, a fluke of fate that had tied her soul to his, and though he loved her with a fierce, possessive intensity, it was a love born of superiority, a devotion that required her to be less so that he could be more. Alara would sit by the hearth, the orange light of the flames dancing in her eyes, and she would listen to the song of the stars that only she could hear, a low, melodic hum that vibrated in her chest and called to the hidden blood flowing through her veins. She felt the itch of her power beneath her skin, a restless energy that wanted to reshape the room, to still the wind, to breathe life into the very stones of the keep. But she held it back, tucking her hands into her sleeves, playing the part of the weak mate who needed his strength to survive the night. She watched him as he pored over maps and ledgers, his brow furrowed in concentration, the weight of his responsibility etched into the lines of his face. She wanted to reach out and tell him that he didn't have to carry it alone, that she could carry the mountains if she chose, but the time was not yet right. The bloodline of the Iasari, the children of the first light, was a secret that required the cover of darkness to mature, and she was the last of her kind, a goddess in hiding among the wolves. There were moments when the mask nearly slipped, like the day the elder wolves challenged her presence, their sneers sharp as daggers as they questioned why a king would choose a mate who couldn't even shift her shape or hunt in the frost. Kalen had stepped between them, his growls shaking the rafters, his dominance absolute as he declared that her weakness was his to protect, and that any insult to her was an insult to his crown. Alara had looked down at her feet, her heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and frustration, for while he defended her, he also diminished her, his protection a cage built of golden bars. She felt the shift in the seasons, the way the air began to thicken with a cloying, unnatural cold that didn't come from the north. The shadows in the corners of the keep began to stretch and twist, taking on shapes that defied the flickering torchlight, and she knew that the ancient enemy, the Void Eaters who had hunted her ancestors to extinction, had finally found the scent of her blood. They were coming for the light she carried, and they would tear through Kalen's pack and his kingdom to get to it. She tried to warn him in the subtle ways she could, speaking of old legends and the weight of the dark, but he only kissed her forehead and told her to sleep, promising that his warriors were the finest in the land. The night the siege began was a night of absolute silence, a stillness so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then, the sky broke, not with thunder, but with a sound like tearing silk as the barrier between realms was breached. The High Keep was swarmed by entities of smoke and malice, creatures that bypassed the iron gates and moved through the walls themselves. Kalen was a whirlwind of violence, his claws and teeth finding purchase in the intangible, his soldiers falling around him as they realized their weapons were useless against the dark. Alara stood in the center of the great hall, the chaos swirling around her, and she saw the moment Kalen realized the true scale of the threat. He looked at her, his face pale with a terror she had never seen before, and he shouted for her to run to the tunnels, to save herself while he gave his life to buy her a few more minutes of breath. But Alara didn't run. She walked toward him, her footsteps light and echoing, and as she moved, the air around her began to shimmer with a silver radiance. The first shadow that lunged for her didn't just miss. It evaporated, turned to ash by the mere proximity of her presence. Kalen stopped, his sword dropping an inch, his eyes widening as he saw the woman he thought he knew dissolve into something ancient and terrifyingly beautiful. Her hair, usually bound in modest braids, came loose and began to float, each strand a thread of pure luminescence. Her eyes, once a soft blue, turned into blinding white suns that illuminated every hidden corner of the hall. The weakness he had spent a year protecting vanished, replaced by a majesty that forced the air out of his lungs. Alara didn't scream. She didn't even raise her voice. She simply spoke a word in the language of the first dawn, and a wave of golden light erupted from her heart, expanding outward in a perfect circle. Every shadow it touched was unmade, every wound it brushed was healed, and every heart it reached was filled with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. The entities of the void were not just defeated, they were erased from existence, their malice no match for the primordial source of all creation. When the light finally settled, the hall was bathed in a soft, ethereal glow, and Alara stood at the center, her skin still humming with power, her gaze fixed on the man she loved. Kalen was on his knees, not because he was wounded, but because his spirit had finally recognized the truth. The weight of his own arrogance, the folly of his claim, and the sheer scale of the being he had tried to cage came crashing down on him. He looked at his hands, the hands that had treated her like a porcelain doll, and then he looked up at her, his eyes filled with a new kind of devotion, one that was stripped of pride and built on the foundation of awe. He lowered his head, his forehead touching the cold, blood-stained stone, and for the first time in his life, the King of the North offered his total, unreserved submission. He didn't just acknowledge her as his mate, he acknowledged her as his sovereign, the hidden heart of his world. Alara moved toward him, her touch no longer hesitant, and as she placed her hand on his head, the warmth of her bloodline flowed into him, binding them together in a way that no pack ritual ever could. The silence that followed was not one of fear, but of peace, the beginning of a story that would be told for 1,000 years, the story of the king who claimed a weak mate and found his god. The mountains seemed to bow in the distance, the stars shone with a renewed brilliance, and in the heart of the keep, the air smelled of honey and ozone. He stayed there, kneeling, waiting for her command, finally understanding that the greatest strength in the universe had always been sitting quietly by his fire, waiting for him to truly see. Alara felt the vibration of his breathing against the air, a ragged, uneven sound that spoke of a world tilted on its axis. And as she looked down at the dark crown of his head, she didn't feel the triumph of a conqueror, but the heavy, aching tenderness of a gardener watching a stubborn oak finally bend to the wind. She reached out, her fingers shimmering with the fading remnants of the dawnlight, and brushed them against his temple, a touch so light it might have been a ghost of a thought, yet it caused a visible shiver to run through his massive frame. Kalen did not pull away. He leaned into it, his eyes remaining fixed on the stone floor, his hands curled into fists against his thighs as if he were trying to anchor himself to a reality that no longer existed. The hall around them was silent, the smoke from the vanished shadows curling like gray ribbons in the stagnant air, and the surviving warriors stood frozen in the periphery, their weapons forgotten, their faces pale masks of disbelief. They had seen their king, a man who had never bowed to any god or mortal, lower himself before the woman they had whispered about in the kitchens and training yards, the woman they had deemed a liability, a soft spot in their ironclad defenses. Ilara spoke his name, and the sound of it was like a bell tolling in a deep canyon, resonant and clear, carrying with it the weight of centuries she had lived in the span of a single heartbeat. She told him to rise, her voice a gentle command that carried no malice, only a weary sort of love that understood the fragility of the ego he had built around himself. Kalen shook his head, a slow, tortured movement, and finally spoke, his voice a gravelly whisper that cracked with the pressure of his realization. He asked her how he could have been so blind, how he could have dared to treat a star like a candle, and the guilt in his tone was a physical thing, a shadow that threatened to eclipse the light she had just fought so hard to bring into the room. Ilara sank to her knees before him, bringing herself to his level so that their eyes were locked, and she saw the raw, exposed nerves of a man who had lost his identity and found something far more terrifying in its place. She took his hands in hers, her warmth seeping into his chilled skin, and she told him that his protection had not been an insult, but a sanctuary, a place where she could rest before the storm that was always destined to find her. She explained that the blood of the Iasari was not a gift of power to be wielded for vanity, but a burden of light that required a vessel of immense quietude to contain it. She had needed his strength, not to defend her life, but to defend her peace, to give her a year of being a woman instead of a weapon, and for that, she would always be in his debt. Kalen's grip on her hands tightened, his knuckles white, as he tried to reconcile the image of the delicate girl who had embroidered by the fire with the celestial entity who had just unmade the void with a whisper. He looked at her, searching her face for any sign of the deception he felt he had been a victim of, but he found only the same steady, unwavering devotion that had been there since the day he brought her home. The power was still there, humming beneath her skin like a hive of golden bees, but she was still Ilara, still the woman who liked the smell of lavender and the way the morning light hit the frost on the windows. The shift in their bond was tectonic, a slow-moving change that would take years to fully map. But in that moment, in the ruins of their great hall, they found a new center. He didn't stand as a king reclaiming his throne. He stood as a partner, a man who realized that his mate was not his prize, but his North Star. He helped her up, his movements careful and reverent as if he were touching something holy, and as they stood together amidst the wreckage, the rest of the keep began to stir. The warriors dropped to their knees one by one, a ripple of movement that moved through the hall like a wave hitting the shore, but Ilara didn't look at them. She kept her eyes on Kalen, watching as he took a deep breath of the ozone-thick air and straightened his shoulders, his pride replaced by a solemn, quiet resolve. He knew that the war had only just begun, that the Void Eaters were but a fraction of what was coming, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the dark. He looked at the woman beside him, the light of the first dawn still dancing in her hair, and he understood that his role had not been to lead her, but to walk beside her into the fire. They moved toward the high windows, where the first real light of morning was beginning to bleed over the mountains, and Ilara leaned her head against his shoulder, her power receding into the deep, quiet places of her soul. The silence between them was no longer filled with the things they didn't say, but with the profound, wordless understanding of two souls who had finally seen each other without the masks of status or expectation. The world outside was still cold, still dangerous, but inside the stone walls of the high keep, a fire had been lit that no shadow could ever hope to extinguish. They stayed there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, the warmth of the day beginning to thaw the ice on the glass, and in the stillness, Kalen finally let go of the man he thought he had to be. He was no longer the sole protector, the iron wall. He was a man who loved a goddess, and in that surrender, he found a strength that was far more enduring than iron. He turned to her, his face softened by the morning light, and he promised her that he would spend the rest of his days learning the song of her blood, that he would be the earth to her sky, the shadow to her light. Ilara smiled, a soft, tired expression that reached her eyes, and she knew that the secret she had carried for so long was finally home. The weight of her heritage was no longer a solitary burden, but a shared legacy, a bridge between the ancient world and the one they were building together. As the keep began to wake, as the sounds of repair and recovery filled the air, they walked out of the hall hand in hand, two beings bound by fate and fire, ready to face whatever the long night had in store. The days that followed the shattering of the sky were draped in a strange, translucent quiet, a period of suspension where the very air of the high keep seemed to vibrate with the memory of the light Alara had unleashed. Kalen moved through the corridors with a new, measured grace, his once boisterous command replaced by a watchful, silent reverence that felt more powerful than his previous thunder. He no longer walked 2 paces ahead of her as a leader guiding his ward. He walked beside her, his hand often finding the small of her back, not to steer her, but to ground himself in the reality of her presence. The servants and warriors watched them with wide, hushed eyes, bowing lower than they ever had for a mere queen, for they sensed the divinity that slept just beneath her skin, a dormant sun that had chosen their cold mountain home as its resting place. In the privacy of their solar, where the fire crackled with a low, blue-tinged warmth, Kalen sat at her feet, his head resting against her knees as she combed her fingers through his dark, thick hair. He confessed to her in the darkness, his voice a low hum that resonated through her bones, about the nights he had spent watching her sleep, thinking he was the one guarding her dreams, never realizing she was the one holding the stars in their courses. He spoke of his pride, how it had been a shield he wore to hide the fear that he was never enough for the crown he wore, and how seeing her true form had stripped away every lie he had ever told himself. Alara listened with her heart wide open, her touch a healing balm upon his spirit, and she shared with him the fragments of her own history, the long, lonely centuries of the Iasari, the way they had watched the world grow cold and forgetful, and the relief she felt in finally being known. She described the sensation of the light as a living thing, a river of molten silver that sang a song of creation, and how it had been both a gift and a curse to carry it in a world that only understood the language of steel. They spent hours in this shared vulnerability, the boundaries between their souls blurring until it was difficult to tell where his shadow ended and her light began. The keep itself seemed to respond to their harmony. The ivy on the outer walls turned a vibrant, eternal green despite the encroaching winter, and the water in the central fountain ran clear and sweet, tasting of mountain springs that had never known the touch of man. But beneath the peace, there was a sharpening of the senses, a preparation for the eyes of the world were now turning toward the high keep. Rumors of the Golden Lady and the king who knelt were spreading like wildfire through the lowlands, drawing the attention of those who coveted power and those who feared it. Kalen began to train his men not just for physical combat, but for a war of spirits, teaching them to hold their ground against the intangible terrors that the void would surely send again. He did so with Alara at his side, her presence a silent testament to the strength that lived in stillness. She didn't carry a sword, but she taught them the rhythm of the breath, the way to find the center of one's own soul when the world becomes a place of shadows. There were moments when the weight of her heritage felt heavy, when the light would itch beneath her palms, demanding to be seen, to be used, to remake the world in its own image. In those moments, it was Kalen who provided the anchor, his steady, earthly heartbeat a reminder of the beauty in being human, in being finite. He would take her into the woods, far from the prying eyes of the court, and let her run through the snow until the sheer physicality of the world calmed the celestial fire in her blood. They would sit by frozen streams, the silence of the forest a soft blanket around them, and he would tell her stories of the wolves, of the earth magic that lived in the roots and the stones, a magic that was different from hers, but no less ancient. He showed her that while she was the sun, he was the deep, rich soil that gave her light a place to land, a place to bloom. Their love, once a thing of possession and duty, had transformed into a cosmic dance, a balance of forces that kept the darkness at bay. One evening, as the first snow of the deep winter began to fall in large, lazy flakes, Kaelin brought her a gift, a circlet not of gold or jewels, but of ironwood and starlight glass, crafted by the oldest smiths of the pack. He placed it upon her brow with hands that trembled slightly, and he didn't call her his mate or his queen, but his soul's reflection. He promised that no matter how many shadows gathered at their gates, he would be the first to meet them, not because she needed protection, but because it was his greatest honor to stand in the glow of her grace. Ilara looked into his eyes and saw not a master, but a partner, a man who had traveled through the valley of his own ego and emerged into the clear, cold light of truth. She pulled him toward her, her breath catching in her throat, and as their lips met, the air around them ignited with a soft, golden aura that warmed the stone walls and sent a message to every dark corner of the realm. The light was no longer hiding, and the king was no longer alone. The journey ahead was long, and the path was shrouded in mystery. But as they stood together in the heart of the keep, the cold of the world felt like a distant memory, a shadow that had finally met its match in the fire of a love that had learned to need. The winter deepened, wrapping the high keep in a shroud of white that seemed to muffle even the sound of the wind. Yet inside the ancient walls, the air was charged with a heat that had nothing to do with the hearths. Ilara found herself walking through the library, her fingers trailing over the spines of crumbling vellum and leather, searching for the echoes of her people that had been scrubbed from the world's memory. Kaelin followed her, a silent shadow whose presence no longer felt like a weight, but like a steadying hand on her shoulder. He watched the way the light from the clerestory windows seemed to cling to her skin, as if the sun itself was reluctant to let her go, and he felt a quiet ache in his chest, a mixture of pride and a lingering, haunting guilt. He had once looked at her and seen a fragile flower to be kept in a glass box, but now he saw the roots that went down into the very foundations of the earth, and the realization made him feel both small and infinitely more significant. He moved closer, his breath hitching as she turned to him with a fragment of a poem she had found, her voice a soft melody that spoke of the stars falling in love with the mountains. She explained that the Iasari did not just wield light. They were the guardians of the balance between the seen and the unseen, and that her power was beginning to wake the memory of the land itself. Outside, the wolves of the pack were changing too. They no longer snarled at the shadows, but stood with their heads high, their eyes reflecting a clarity they had never known. The rumors from the lowlands finally took shape in the form of an embassy from the Iron Cities, men clad in steam-stained brass and cold logic, who came to see if the tales of a celestial queen were true. Kaelin met them in the courtyard, his stance relaxed but his eyes like flint, and when they spoke of treaties and the regulation of unnatural forces, he simply stepped aside to reveal Ilara standing on the dais. She didn't need to speak. She merely let the veil of her humanity thin for a heartbeat, allowing the radiance of the first dawn to spill from her eyes. The ambassadors, men who believed only in what they could touch and measure, fell to their knees as if the gravity of the world had suddenly doubled. It wasn't fear that brought them down, but the sheer, undeniable reality of something greater than their machines and their greed. Kaelin watched them, and then he looked at Ilara, a small, knowing smile touching his lips, the smile of a man who had already made that pilgrimage to the floor. Later that night, as the stars burned like cold diamonds above the peaks, they stood on the highest battlements, the world stretched out below them in a tapestry of shadow and silver. Kaelin took her hand, his thumb tracing the delicate lines of her palm, and he asked her if she ever regretted choosing him, a creature of fur and tooth, when she could have had the heavens. Ilara turned to him, the wind catching her hair and turning it into a halo of spun moonlight, and she told him that the heavens were vast and lonely, but his heart was a fire that kept her soul from freezing. She leaned into him, her head resting against his chest, listening to the rhythmic beat that anchored her to the earth. She felt the ancient power within her stir, sensing the far-off approach of more shadows, but she didn't feel the old coldness of dread. She felt a fierce, burning resolve. They were no longer a king and his mate. They were the dawn and the mountain, a union of the celestial and the terrestrial that would rewrite the laws of the dark. Kaelin pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his eyes fixed on the horizon, ready to be the shield that stood before her light, finally understanding that his greatest strength lay not in his command, but in his capacity to be led by a love that transcended the world. The silence of the night was a promise, a soft breath held between two hearts that had found their true north in the middle of a storm. The morning brought a new kind of clarity to the high keep, a light that didn't just illuminate the halls, but seemed to wash away the stains of 1,000 years of isolation. And as the ambassadors from the iron cities departed with their heads bowed and their gears silenced, Alara felt the weight of her ancestors' eyes upon her from the ether. She stood at the edge of the great stone map in the war room, her fingers tracing the jagged lines of the northern ranges, and she felt the pulse of the earth vibrating through the wood and stone, a low hum that synced with the rhythm of her own heart. Kaelin appeared in the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the harsh glare of the sun, but his presence no longer felt like an intrusion. It felt like the missing piece of a puzzle she had been trying to solve for lifetimes. He approached her with a quiet reverence, his footsteps softened by the thick rugs, and he didn't ask what she was doing or try to offer a solution to a problem he didn't yet understand. He simply stood beside her, his warmth a familiar comfort against the drafty air, and he waited for her to speak, acknowledging that the map of the world had changed the moment she let her light break through the surface of her skin. She spoke of the ley lines, the veins of the world that had grown clogged with the dust of the void, and how her bloodline was not merely a crown of light, but a key to the very machinery of existence. Kaelin listened with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way that was almost painful, his gaze never leaving her face as he absorbed the truth of her divinity. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers before he finally made contact, his skin rough and calloused against her silken palm, and the contrast was a reminder of the bridge they were building between the mortal and the eternal. He told her, in a voice that was thick with a newfound humility, that he had spent his life trying to be the strongest thing in the room, only to realize that true strength was the ability to hold the light without letting it consume you. They walked together out into the gardens, where the frost was beginning to melt into 1,000 tiny diamonds on the petals of the winter roses. And for the first time, Alara didn't feel the need to hide the glow that simmered beneath her fingernails. She let it spill out, a gentle, golden warmth that encouraged the dormant seeds to stir, and she watched as the color returned to the garden in defiance of the season. Kaelin watched her, his heart full of a quiet, terrifying love, and he realized that his role had shifted from being her keeper to being her anchor, the solid, unyielding earth that allowed her to reach for the sun without drifting away. The pack members they passed didn't look away anymore. They paused in their duties, their heads dipping in a sign of respect that was no longer demanded by fear, but offered by a soul-deep recognition of her grace. The elder wolves, once so vocal in their disdain for the weak human girl, now watched from the shadows with a mixture of awe and repentance, seeing in her the salvation they hadn't known they needed. Alara felt their shift in perception and met it with a quiet, steady compassion, for she knew that the light was meant to heal, not to burn, and that their fear was only a symptom of their long darkness. As the evening shadows began to stretch across the courtyard, Kaelin led her to the ancient oak at the center of the keep, a tree that was said to have been planted when the first wolves claimed the mountain. He knelt before the gnarled roots, and then he looked up at her, beckoning her to join him in a ritual of connection that was older than his crown. They pressed their hands to the bark, and Alara let her power flow through her arms and into the tree, feeling the ancient consciousness of the wood wake up and sing. The leaves, once brown and brittle, turned a deep, shimmering silver, and the tree began to pulse with a light that mirrored her own, turning the center of the keep into a sanctuary of starlight. Kaelin looked at her, his face illuminated by the radiance, and he told her that he had never known what it meant to be truly alive until he saw the world through her eyes. The guilt of his past treatment of her still lingered in the corners of his mind, but she reached out and brushed it away with a touch, telling him that the person she had been was a cocoon, and the person she was now was only possible because of the safety his walls had provided. They sat beneath the silver oak for hours, the air around them smelling of ozone and ancient earth, and they spoke of the future, not as a king and his consort, but as two halves of a whole. The threat of the void was still out there, a gathering storm on the horizon, but they felt a strange, quiet confidence that together they could weather any darkness. Kalen's pack was no longer just a collection of warriors. They were becoming a beacon, a center of light in a world that had been cold for too long. He realized that by kneeling to her, he had found a higher purpose than just ruling. He had found the path to becoming the man she deserved. Every breath they shared was a vow, a silent promise to protect the balance they had found. And as the moon climbed high into the sky, the light of the Iasari and the strength of the wolves blended into a single, unbreakable cord of fate. The warmth of the solar was a thick, velvety blanket that seemed to absorb the frantic howling of the storm outside, creating a pocket of world-defying peace where the only clock was the slow, steady rhythm of their breathing. Kalen sat on the rug by the hearth, his large frame casting a long shadow against the stone. And as he leaned his head back against the velvet of the chaise where Alara rested, he felt the heavy mantle of his kingship finally beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a thread of something far more enduring. He reached up, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her jaw with a reverence that made his own heart feel too large for his chest, and he whispered of the nights before he knew the truth, when he had looked at her and felt a desperate, primal need to hide her away from the world's teeth. He confessed that his arrogance had been a wall built to contain a fear he couldn't name, the fear that a creature as soft and light as she was could never truly belong to a man who was made of scars and shadows. Alara let her fingers drift down to settle over his heart, feeling the powerful thrumming of his life force, and she told him that the strength he had used to guard her was never a mistake, only an incomplete gesture. She explained that the Iasari had always chosen the strongest anchors, not to be held captive, but to be held steady, for a sun without a world to warm is merely a lonely fire in the void. As she spoke, she let a tiny spark of her essence bleed into him, a golden warmth that didn't just sit on the skin but traveled deep into his veins, seeking out the old aches of battles long past and the cold spots left by his own self-doubt. Kalen let out a long, shuddering breath, his eyes closing as the radiance worked through him, knitting together the broken places of his spirit until he felt a clarity that was almost dizzying. The pack outside the heavy oak doors could feel the shift too. The restlessness that usually accompanied a winter storm had settled into a vigilant, quiet readiness, a collective heartbeat that was beginning to sync with the sanctuary of the solar. Alara watched the flames in the hearth and saw visions of the ancient world dancing in the embers, great cities of crystal and light that had fallen not to strength, but to the slow erosion of hope. She knew that the voideers were feeding on that same erosion now, creeping through the valleys and whispering to the desperate, and she understood that her role was not just to defeat the dark, but to provide a reason for the light to return. She turned her gaze back to Kalen, seeing the man who had knelt in the ruins of his own pride, and she saw the first true night of the new dawn. He looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the gold of her power and the deep blue of his own loyalty, and he asked her what the world would require of them next. Alara didn't answer with a strategy or a command. She answered with a kiss that tasted of cedar and starlight, a promise that whatever the shadows took, they would find a way to grow it back. The intimacy between them had become a ritual of survival, a way of reinforcing the bridge that kept the celestial from drifting away from the mortal. In the days that followed, the High Keep became a beacon in earnest, the silver oak in the courtyard glowing with a soft, persistent light that could be seen from the lower villages, a silent signal that the old gods had not entirely forsaken the earth. Kalen spent his mornings in the training yards, but the air was different now. There was no shouting, no ego-driven displays of dominance, only the focused hum of men and women learning to move as one. He taught them that the blade was only the extension of the will, and that a will anchored in the light was unbreakable. Ilara would walk among them, her presence a calming balm that stilled the trembling hands and quieted the fearful minds, and she began to realize that the weakness Kaelin had seen in her was actually her greatest weapon, the ability to be soft in a world that had forgotten how to yield. She would touch a shoulder or offer a word of encouragement, and the warriors would find their strength doubled, not by magic, but by the sudden, overwhelming belief that they were part of something holy. Yet, in the deep of the night, when the light of the keep was the only thing standing against the absolute black of the mountain, Ilara felt the itch of her bloodline growing more insistent, a calling to the high places where the veil was thinnest. She knew she would eventually have to step beyond the walls Kaelin had built, to meet the source of the shadow on its own ground, and the thought of leaving the safety of his arms made the light within her flicker with a human sort of dread. She didn't have to say it aloud. Kaelin felt the tremor in her soul through the bond that now tethered them. He took her to the highest tower, the wind whipping his cloak around them like a dark wing, and he promised her that wherever the light went, the shadow would follow to protect it. He wouldn't ask her to stay in the cage of his protection anymore, but he would be the shield that stood between her and the cold, the iron that gave her fire a place to burn. They stood there for a long time, watching the distant, flickering lights of the enemy, crested on the horizon, two souls forged into one, ready to face the end of an age and the beginning of a legend that would be written in the blood of the stars and the grit of the earth. The wind atop the tower was a restless traveler, carrying the scent of ancient ice and the metallic tang of the approaching void. Yet as Kaelin pulled Ilara closer into the shelter of his heavy furs, the cold felt like a distant, powerless thing. He could feel the low-frequency hum of her power vibrating against his chest, a celestial engine that was slowly recalibrating the world around them, and he realized with a start that he no longer feared the magnitude of what she was. The days of treating her like a fragile treasure were gone, replaced by a profound, marrow-deep respect for the burden she carried, a burden that he now understood was the only thing keeping the horizon from collapsing into shadow. He looked down at her, her face pale and luminous under the light of a moon that seemed to shine specifically for her, and he saw the flicker of exhaustion behind her sun-bright eyes, a human weariness that tethered her divinity to the earth. He didn't ask if she was ready for the coming war. Instead, he spoke of the garden they would plant when the sun returned for good, of the way the river would sound once the ice was broken by more than just her magic. He was building a future for her with his words, a place for her soul to rest when the fire was no longer needed, and Ilara felt the jagged edges of her fear being smoothed over by the steady, unyielding strength of his devotion. They descended from the heights together, their footsteps echoing in the spiral staircase like a heartbeat, and as they entered the great hall, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of silence, a silence of absolute, unified purpose. The warriors of the north didn't look at Kaelin for a command. They looked at the way he walked beside her, his hand never leaving hers, and they understood that the hierarchy of their world had been fundamentally rewritten. The king had not been supplanted. He had been elevated by his surrender, his authority now a reflection of the light she provided. Ilara stopped in the center of the hall, her presence drawing the air toward her, and she reached out to the silver oak that grew through the stones, its branches now heavy with leaves that pulsed like living stars. She closed her eyes and extended her senses beyond the walls, feeling the roots of the tree as they tunneled deep into the mountain, acting as veins for the power she was pouring back into the land. She could feel the void creatures out there, pressing against the edges of her influence, their malice like a cold oil trying to find a crack in a glass vessel. But she also felt the sudden, fierce response of the earth itself. The mountain was waking up, its ancient stone consciousness stirred by the blood of the Iasari, and Kaelin felt the floor beneath his boots tremble with a vitality that made his own wolf spirit howl with recognition. He saw the way the shadows in the corners of the hall retreated, not because of a torch, but because the very atoms of the keep were beginning to glow with a soft, persistent resonance. Later, in the quiet of their solar, Kalen knelt before the hearth to stoke the fire, his movements deliberate and humble, a king performing the work of a servant because he wanted her to be warm. He looked back at her where she sat, her hands resting in her lap, and he told her that he had spent his whole life looking for a mate who would make him stronger, never realizing that the mate he needed was the one who would make him better. He confessed that the moment he first saw her kneel to the light within herself, he had felt the iron bands around his own heart break, freeing him from the need to be the only sun in his sky. Elara moved from the chaise to join him on the floor, her movement fluid and graceful, and she rested her forehead against his, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. She told him that the strength of the Iasari was a lonely thing without the grit and bone of the world to hold it, and that his love was the only thing that kept her from dissolving into the stars. They stayed there as the night deepened, a man of earth and a woman of light, two halves of a shattered world finally finding their fit. The threat was still there, a gathering storm that would test every fiber of their being. But as the fire cast long, dancing shadows against the walls, those shadows no longer held any terror. They were just the absence of light, and in this room, in this keep, the light was finally home. The silver oak outside continued to pulse, a beacon for all those lost in the dark, and inside, the king and his mate prepared to face the dawn, no longer as master and subject, but as a single, unbreakable force of nature. The morning that followed the storm was unlike any other in the history of the High Keep, for the sun did not merely rise. It seemed to be summoned by the lingering warmth of Alara's presence. The light that spilled across the breakfast table was thick and golden, tasting of honey and old memories, and Kalen watched the way it danced across Alara's features, as if the rays were trying to reclaim their sister. He sat across from her, his usual heavy armor replaced by a simple tunic of dark wool, his posture relaxed in a way that would have been unthinkable a few months prior. He found himself mesmerized by the simple, human movements of her hands, the way she tore a piece of bread, the way she lifted her cup, and he felt a profound sense of wonder that such a celestial force could find joy in the mundane. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing the back of her hand, and the contact sent a ripple of silver light through her skin, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that now sang between them. He told her, his voice low and intimate, that he had lived his entire life in a world of gray and iron, never knowing that the color had simply been waiting for her to arrive. Elara looked up, her eyes soft and depthless, and she told him that the light was only beautiful because it had his shadows to play against, that without the solid reality of his love, she would be nothing but a blinding, lonely glare. They spent the morning walking through the lower wards of the keep, witnessing the quiet revolution their union had sparked. The healers were finding that wounds closed faster under the glow of the silver oak, and the children played with a fearlessness that had been absent for generations. Kalen watched his people and realized that he was no longer ruling through the threat of his claws, but through the promise of her grace, a shift that made the crown feel lighter than it ever had. They reached the gates of the keep, looking out over the valley where the snow was beginning to retreat, revealing patches of green that shouldn't have been there for another month. Elara felt the earth calling to her, a deep, resonant pulse that asked for her to step out into the world and begin the work of restoration. Kalen didn't hesitate. He called for their horses, not as a king preparing for a campaign, but as a man preparing for a pilgrimage. They rode out into the softening woods, the sound of the horses' hooves a rhythmic heartbeat against the damp earth, and for the first time, Elara felt the weight of her hidden bloodline not as a secret to be guarded, but as a gift to be shared. They stopped by a stream that had been choked with ice and dark sediment, and Elara knelt at the water's edge, her hands dipping into the flow. As she let her power trickle into the current, the water cleared instantly, the dark magic of the void washing away like soot, and Kalen knelt beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back to steady her. He felt the surge of her energy passing through him, a searing, beautiful heat that made him feel as though he were being forged anew, and he understood then that his life would always be this, a constant, willing surrender to a force he could never fully comprehend, but would always protect. They stayed by the water as the afternoon turned to a soft, lilac twilight, the air around them filled with the scent of waking earth and the quiet promise of a spring that would never truly end. Kaelin turned to her, his face a map of devotion and hard-won peace, and he promised her that he would be the soil for her light as long as his heart continued to beat. Alara leaned into him, the radiance of her soul mingling with the strength of his body, and she knew that the journey ahead was no longer a path of fear, but a dance of starlight and stone. The world was changing, the old orders were falling away, and in their place, a king and his mate stood as the first witnesses to a dawn that would finally stay. The water of the stream, now purged of its oily darkness, sang a new song against the smooth river stones, a sound that seemed to echo the crystalline clarity that had taken root in the spaces between Alara and Kaelin. As they rose from the muddy bank, Kaelin reached out to brush a stray smudge of earth from her cheek, his touch so deliberate and slow that it felt like a silent prayer. He no longer moved with the restless, jagged energy of a man trying to prove his dominance over the wilderness. Instead, he moved with the steady, quiet gravity of a mountain that had found its sun. They remounted their horses and continued further into the heart of the ancient forest, where the trees grew so tall and thick that the sky was merely a series of sapphire fragments glimpsed through a canopy of silvered pine. Alara could feel the forest breathing, a slow, deep inhalation of the light she had begun to radiate, and she realized that the land had been waiting for an Iasari to return not as a conqueror, but as a sister. Kaelin watched her as they rode, nodding the way the shadows seemed to bow out of her path, and he felt a strange, humbling peace in being the one permitted to follow in her wake. He thought back to the early days of their mating, when he had treated her silence as a sign of a small spirit, and the memory made him tighten his grip on the reins in a spasm of regret. But as if sensing his thoughts, Alara turned her head and offered him a smile that was both ancient and tender, a look that told him he was forgiven for the man he used to be. They reached a high ridge where the trees thinned, revealing the vast expanse of the Northern Territories, and for the first time, Alara saw the true scale of the task ahead of her. The void had left scars across the horizon, patches of gray and lifeless earth that looked like bruises on the skin of the world. She felt a sudden, sharp wave of vertigo, the sheer magnitude of the light required to heal such a world threatening to pull the consciousness right out of her body. Kaelin was off his horse in an instant, his arms wrapping around her before her knees could even buckle, and he pulled her against the solid heat of his chest. He didn't tell her to be strong. He didn't demand that she use her power. He simply held her, his heartbeat a steady, rhythmic drum that gave her a place to land when the celestial heights became too much to bear. He whispered into her hair, telling her that the world had survived 1,000 winters, and that she didn't have to heal it all in a single afternoon. He reminded her that even the sun sets to rest, and that he would be her night, the dark, safe place where she could simply be Alara, the woman who loved the smell of rain and the warmth of a fire. They stayed there on the ridge as the sun began its slow descent, the air turning into a liquid gold that seemed to coat the world in honey. Alara let her head rest in the hollow of his shoulder, the light within her settling into a soft, manageable hum, and she realized that this was the true secret of her bloodline, that the power was not meant to be a solitary fire, but a shared warmth. The pack, which had been following at a respectful distance, began to emerge from the tree line, their eyes no longer glowing with the red fire of hunger, but with the steady silver of the new dawn. They gathered in a semicircle around their king and his mate, and as one, they lowered their heads, a collective gesture of submission that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with hope. Kaelin looked at his people, and then back at the woman in his arms, and he knew that the High Keep was no longer just a fortress. It was the seed of a new world. They made a small camp there on the ridge, the fire they built crackling with a vitality that seemed to draw the very stars closer to the earth. Kaelin took care of the horses and prepared their meal with a quiet, focused humility, his every movement a testament to the way his soul had learned to kneel. When they finally lay down beneath the vast, sparking tapestry of the night sky, he pulled her into the curve of his body, his large hand resting protectively over her heart. He told her stories of the constellations from the perspective of the wolves, of how the great hunter was actually a guardian who watched over the sleeping world, and Alara felt the ancient myths of her own people blending with the earthy legends of his. The boundary between their histories was dissolving, creating a new narrative written in the quiet spaces between their breaths. As sleep finally began to claim them, Alara felt the light within her pulse one last time, a gentle, golden ripple that spread out across the ridge and into the valleys below, a silent promise that the dawn was coming, and that this time it would be a dawn that everyone could share. Kaelin's breathing was deep and even, a foundational sound that made the entire mountain feel safe. And in that moment, Alara knew that the greatest power she possessed was not the light of the Iasari, but the love of the man who had learned that true strength was found in the grace of surrender. The first touch of the sun on the ridge was not a harsh intrusion, but a soft, golden invitation, waking Alara from a dream of floating through a sea of liquid stars, where Kaelin's voice had been the only anchor keeping her from drifting into the infinite. She opened her eyes to find him already awake, his gaze fixed on her with a quiet, steady devotion that made the cold mountain air feel like a summer breeze. He was propped up on one elbow, his other hand resting near her head, tracing the patterns of frost that had formed on the edge of their blankets, and the look in his eyes was one of such profound peace that she felt the last of her celestial defenses dissolve. He didn't speak immediately, allowing the silence of the morning to wrap around them like a shared secret, but when he finally did, his voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate directly into her soul. He told her that he had spent the hours of the night watching the way the starlight seemed to recognize her, how the very cosmos seemed to lean in toward her while she slept, and he admitted with a wry, humble smile that he felt like a thief who had accidentally stolen the most precious thing in the universe. Alara reached up to touch his face, her fingers warm against his skin, and she told him that she was not a prize to be stolen, but a soul that had finally found its home in the shadow of his strength. They broke camp with a slow, synchronized grace, the usual hurry of the pack replaced by a contemplative rhythm that honored the changing world around them. As they began the descent back toward the high keep, Alara noticed that the path they had taken the day before was already beginning to transform. Where her power had touched the earth, the gray, lifeless patches were now dotted with small, resilient sprouts of silver-leafed clover that glowed with a faint, internal light. Kaelin dismounted frequently to clear the path of fallen branches or sharp stones, his every action a silent testament to his desire to make the world softer for her feet. He no longer saw her as someone who needed to be carried, but as someone whose journey deserved the utmost reverence. When they reached the lower valleys, the villagers came out of their cottages, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and disbelief as they saw their king walking beside the woman who radiated a warmth like a second sun. Kaelin didn't command them to bow, yet they did so anyway, their gestures directed not at his crown, but at the unity the couple represented. He took Alara's hand as they walked through the village square, and he spoke to his people not as a distant ruler, but as a man who had seen the light and wanted to share its promise. He told them that the winter of their souls was over, and that the High Keep was no longer a fortress of iron, but a beacon of the Iasari's grace. Alara felt the collective heartbeat of the people rising to meet her own, a surge of human emotion that felt more powerful than any celestial energy. She realized that her bloodline was not just a lineage of power, but a lineage of service, a bridge that could heal the broken spirit of a nation. As the towers of the keep came into view, shimmering like a mirage against the azure sky, Kaelin stopped his horse and looked at her, his eyes shining with a fierce, quiet pride. He told her that for the rest of his life, he would be the first to kneel and the last to leave her side, that his kingdom was no longer a territory to be defended, but a sanctuary to be nurtured under her light. Alara leaned over and pressed her forehead against his, the silence between them filled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken vows. They were no longer the master and the mate. They were the architects of a new era, two souls who had traveled through the darkest night to find a dawn that would never fade. The silver oak in the courtyard stood tall as they rode through the gates, its leaves singing a soft, metallic song in the breeze, welcoming back the goddess who had chosen to be a woman and the king who had found his true power in the act of kneeling. Every step they took into the keep felt like a new beginning, a slow, beautiful unfolding of a story that would be told long after the mountains had turned to dust, a story of a love that was strong enough to humble a king and bright enough to save a world. The stones of the high keep seemed to absorb the new light of their arrival, turning from a cold, oppressive gray to a warm, pearlescent hue that caught the flickering glow of the torches and held it like a cherished memory. As they crossed the threshold into the great hall, the air was thick with the scent of pine needles and the sweet, ozone-tinged breath of the silver oak, a fragrance that seemed to soothe the raw edges of the warriors' spirits as they went about their evening tasks. Kalen did not return to his throne, that high, lonely chair carved from the heart of a mountain. Instead, he led Alara to the long table where the common meals were shared, pulling out a heavy oak chair for her with a gentleness that silenced the room. He sat beside her, his arm draped along the back of her chair, not as a barricade against the world, but as a silent testament that he was her shadow, her most devoted guardian. The meal was a simple affair of roasted meats and dark bread, yet it tasted of something sacred, a communion between the ancient blood of the wolves and the celestial fire of the Iasari. Alara felt the weight of her lineage settling into a comfortable rhythm within her, no longer a frantic secret clawing at her ribs, but a steady, glowing furnace that warmed everyone in her presence. She watched Kalen as he spoke to his lieutenants, noticing the way he listened now, his ego no longer a wall that filtered out the truth, but a window that allowed him to see the needs of his people with a clarity he had never possessed. He would turn to her often, his eyes seeking her counsel in the silent language of their bond, and she would offer a small nod or a soft word that seemed to settle the most complex of disputes. The evening bled into a deep, velvety night, and they eventually retreated to their solar, the space now a sanctuary of light and shadow, where the fire burned with a persistent, blue-hearted flame. Kalen helped her out of her heavy riding cloak, his fingers lingering on her shoulders as he felt the warmth radiating from her skin, a warmth that was not of this earth. He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her cheeks, and he spoke of the long years he had spent in the dark, thinking that strength was a matter of how much one could take, rather than how much one could give. He admitted that his pride had been a cage, one that he had forced her into alongside himself, and the regret in his voice was like a slow-moving river, deep and heavy with the silt of the past. Alara placed her hands over his, her thumbs tracing the lines of his palms, and she told him that the cage had been broken the moment he saw her not as a possession, but as a person. She explained that the Iasari did not seek to rule but to sustain, and that his kneeling had been the final key that unlocked the true potential of her light. For power without humility is a fire that only consumes. They sat together by the hearth, the world outside silenced by the thick stone walls, and they spoke of the things they would build in the ruins of the old ways. Kalen wanted to create schools where the history of the light could be taught alongside the songs of the wolves, a place where the next generation would not have to fear the shadows because they understood the source of the sun. Alara felt a profound sense of rightness in his words, a feeling that they were finally weaving their disparate threads into a single, unbreakable cord. As the hours drifted toward the early morning, Kalen took her hand and led her to the balcony, where the stars seemed to hang lower than usual, their light reflecting in the silver leaves of the oak tree below. He pointed to the horizon, where the first hint of a new dawn was beginning to smudge the indigo sky, and he told her that he no longer felt the need to claim her as his mate, for he realized that she had always belonged to the universe, and that he was merely the lucky man chosen to walk beside her. Alara leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart full of a peace she had never thought possible for one of her kind. She felt the light within her pulse in time with his heartbeat, a rhythmic, golden vibration that promised a future where the fragility he had once feared was revealed to be the very foundation of their strength. The keep was silent now, the pack sleeping in the safety of their shadow and her light, and as the first real ray of the morning sun touched the battlements, it found them standing together, two souls who had survived the claim of the dark to find the freedom of the dawn. Kaylin's grip on her hand was firm and steady, a grounding force that allowed her to shine as brightly as she needed to. And in that moment, the king and his mate were no longer separate entities, but a single, luminous force of nature, ready to heal the world one sunrise at a time. The air grew still, a quiet hush falling over the mountain as the light expanded, turning the snow into a field of diamonds and the shadows into soft, fleeting memories. They knew the void was still out there, lurking in the forgotten places, but they also knew that the light was no longer hiding, and that a king who has learned to kneel can never truly be defeated. The light of the rising sun hit the silver oak with a sudden, piercing clarity, and in that moment, the atmosphere of the high keep didn't just brighten, it underwent a fundamental shift in the laws of reality. Alara felt a sharp, crystalline snap deep within her marrow, a final seal dissolving that she hadn't even known existed, and the flood of memory that rushed in was not of her own life, but of the very first breath of the world. She looked at Kaylin, whose hand was still clasped in hers, and as the radiance of the Iasari spilled out of her eyes in rivers of molten white, she saw him not as a king of wolves, but as the literal shadow cast by her own light since the dawn of time. The truth arrived with the weight of a falling mountain. The Void Eaters she had been fighting were not an external plague, but the fractured, starving echoes of her own divinity that had been discarded centuries ago when her ancestors tried to become mortal. And Kaylin's entire bloodline had been created not to be her equal, but to be her cage. He was the iron shackle, the beautiful, sentient lock designed to keep the sun from burning the world to cinders, and every time he had protected her, he had unknowingly been reinforcing the prison of her soul. She felt a wave of profound, cosmic irony wash over her as she realized that her weakness was the only thing that had kept him standing. The more she had faded, the more he had been allowed to flourish as a king. Kaylin's face went ash-pale as the connection between them flared into a blinding circuit of truth, and he felt his own power, the heavy, grounding strength of the earth, begin to dissolve in the presence of her full ascension. He saw the shadows outside the keep stop their assault and begin to dissolve, not because they were defeated, but because they were being reabsorbed into the blinding halo that now surrounded Alara. He realized in a heartbeat of sheer, terrifying awe that the woman he had claimed as a weak mate was the very source of the gravity that held his kingdom together, and that his role as a protector was a lie crafted by a forgotten history to keep the goddess from her throne. The physical world began to blur at the edges, the stone of the battlements turning to light under her feet, and Kaylin felt the primal, instinctual urge of his bloodline to assert control, to pull her back down to the dirt, to wrap her in the safety of his iron walls once more. But he looked into her eyes, suns within suns, and he made a choice that no guardian before him had ever dared to make. He didn't try to anchor her, he let go of the chain. He felt the crown of his ego crumble into dust, the weight of his kingship evaporating as he realized that the only way to save her was to lose the man he thought he was. He sank to his knees, but it wasn't the kneeling of a subject to a queen or a man to a lover. It was the total, ecstatic surrender of the earth to the sky. As he touched his forehead to the shimmering stone, the weakness he had once pitied in her flowed into him, a cool, healing stream of mortality that finally allowed him to be something other than a weapon. Alara reached down, her touch no longer human but a caress of pure energy, and she didn't lift him up. She pulled him into the light with her, merging the shadow of his existence into the brilliance of her own. The twist of their fate was a beautiful, jagged thing. She had needed his weakness to find her humanity, and he had needed her power to find his peace. The keep, the mountains, and the very air were rewritten in that single moment of unity, turning the fortress into a temple where the darkness and the light were finally, irrevocably the same thing. He looked up at her, his eyes now reflecting the same starlight that lived in hers, and he understood that the reign of the wolves was over, replaced by a kingdom where the king was the first to serve, and the mate was the breath of the world itself. The silence that followed was the first true silence the earth had known in 1,000 years, a peace that was both a finish and a beginning, where the memory of her hidden bloodline became the heartbeat of every living thing.